Welcome back to BeeWellWithMS podcast, where we explore groundbreaking topics in health and neurology. I'm your host, Dr. Agnes Rukiane, and today's episode, titled The Future of Aging Exploring Longevity Medicine, features Dr. Marco Quarta. Dr. Quarta is a pioneer in the field of aging and regenerative medicine and leads Rubedo Life Sciences, focusing on developing innovative treatments that combat the chronic age-related diseases and enhances lifespan and health span. His work uniquely targets pathological cells associated with biological aging, such as senescent-like cells. Dr. Quarta's scientific journey began with Masters in Biotechnology, followed by a PhD in Neurosciences, and extensive postdoctoral training in aging and stem cell biology under Professor Thomas Rando at Stanford University School of Medicine. He has led translational medical research teams at Stanford and the VA hospital in Palo Alto, focusing on aging and regenerative medicine. With over 20 years of research experience, Dr. Quarta has made significant contributions to the field through numerous scientific publications and international patents. He co-founded and serves on the boards of Wetware Concepts and Turn Biotechnologies, and is actively involved in advisory roles, including the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine and the Paul F. Glenn Center for the Biology of Aging Studies at Stanford University. Dr. Quarta is also the co-founder and president of the Fudon Institute and nonprofit scientific society dedicated to advancing longevity medicine. So join us as we delve into how Dr. Quarta's groundbreaking work is shaping the future and how we understand and treat the aging process. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform to catch every insightful episode. So welcome to this episode, Marco.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure and an honor to share a little bit of my experience.
Wonderful. So to start this episode, which I'm truly fascinated about, and I started reading about longevity medicine a couple of years ago and started buying some vitamin supplements. I bought a list of the vitamins for my dad, and I'm trying to sort of change and alter his aging process and experimenting on him, which is probably not ideal, but I see some changes and I'm very, very glad, but I would like to talk to experts. So my first question, Dr. Quarta, can you share what initially drew you into the field of anti-aging medicine?
Well, that's a good question. In reality, started in a very, very young age. I had my inspiration that I wanted to, let's say, cure aging in a very naive way, but when I was 5 years old. So it was very early. And I remember that day I decided I wanted to be a scientist and a scientist that can cure aging. So I went to my parents and said that, and they said, okay, well, good luck, but we can help. I mean, luckily I had several scientists and physicians in the family. So they started to give me, which I wanted, like as a gift, I wanted a microscope, but a real microscope. I wanted a chemistry kit and things like that. So a year later, I had my little lab in my room, started to play. But I never stopped, so I'm still playing in a maybe more sophisticated way, but less naive, knowing now after a long journey that aging is such a complex phenomenon, multifaceted phenomenon, and it's possible to change the trajectory, but of course the complexity is very high, and I see things in a different perspective now, and we can talk more from a clinical and scientific standpoint, but definitely targeting in this biology is a possibility. But so that's what really was my personal mission. So everything I've done, my studies, the choices that I made was always with this idea in mind, learning, understanding better how, not just how aging works, but how we can change it. So that's why regenerative medicine and then rejuvenative medicine or longevity medicine. So we started working as an undergrad in one of the labs in Bologna. under the patronage of a Nobel laureate, Rita Levi-Montalcini, studying brain aging and other processes related to that. And I continued. So when I went to Stanford doing my postdoc, before then directing this Center of Excellence that you mentioned, working on aging regenerative medicine, but I joined the lab of Tom Rando, which is one of the pioneers in the field. Is the person who, in his lab, discovered the concept of parabiosis. What does it mean is, long story short, they found that the young blood can make old people or animals younger. So there are factors in the young blood. People joked as a vampire effect, but there is really a science behind. There are circulating factors in the young blood that can have a rejuvenative effect. And work, so I done that lab working on stem cells and aging biology and regeneration, which then continue in my current work, current days. But spinning into more translation. So my goal was not just doing discoveries. My goal has always been making medicine that can benefit people. So to give something back to humanity, not just to keep it for the academic ivory tower. And so I've done several companies in my career, starting from my PhD when I was in Italy back then. That was my first experience, and I continued until current days. So now my focus is in leading one of these two companies, Rubedo Life Sciences, which we can talk later, and involved in other companies that I co-founded, like Turn Bio. But happy to explain more.
Wow. So if you would like to become a scientist in this world, you start at age 5. From Marco experience.
Well,
this is where when you start. So, and then you evolve. So it's a lifestyle, what you do in this life, it's a mission, as you said, and you started very early and pursue your dream to change the lifespan for people, living with various different conditions, and how we age is a separate science, whether we have the chronic underlying conditions or we don't. By default, we all age. And today we are delving into how can we slow down the aging process, maybe change the whole game and maybe become younger. Instead of being 50 years old, maybe we could be biologically 30 years old. So what exactly do you mean by longevity medicines? How do they play the role in your research, and what kind of research do you do at the moment?
So longevity medicine refers to this idea that we target master regulators of the biological aging processes, which is not the chronological age. The chronological age is what is your actual age based on your birth date. It can be 20, 50, 70, but it doesn't necessarily correlate with your biological age, meaning that you could be biologically younger or older from an literally cellular standpoint or physiological standpoint, health standpoint. Now, also, we have to say that everybody ages in different ways and in different rates, or at least there are different trajectories of how we can age. And that's why also adds the complexity, which means, and we'll touch base later, that we not all necessarily need or benefit from the same type of intervention. So let's say longevity medicine intervention, or at different times during our lifetimes, someone might need something at 40, someone else at 65. But also within the same person, the different organs and tissues age at different rates. And that because of genetics, because of how lifestyle, how we expose our tissues and organs. For example, a smoker will have lung tissue and actually several other tissues, skin and heart, etc., prematurely aged, because this drives a number of phenomena that are causing this biological aging process. Viruses, we saw with COVID recently, SARS-CoV-2, for example, is accelerator of aging in certain cell, in the lung, in the heart again, etc., by inducing, which we'll talk in a second, a phenomenon called cellular senescence. Also, smoking does that. Also, the sun does that into the skin, for example. A cancer survivor had chemotherapy, radiotherapy, immunotherapy, which are designed to aggressively target highly proliferative aggressive cells. But those therapies are not precise enough, and so they damage healthy cells as well. That as a result, they become senescent. And I'll explain in a moment what it is. But cancer survivors are prematurely aged, so they really experience age-related diseases sometimes decades sooner, including children, like pediatric cancer survivors. They will experience the typical age-related disease of a 65-year-old person in their mid-30s. Neurodegenerative, cardiovascular, more cancer, right? So this is really a phenomenon that is plastic. So if it can be accelerated, it can also be delayed. And understanding what are those mechanisms and how to target them translates into therapeutics, into novel medicine. We think as medicine 3.0, that can really change the trajectory of the aging process. But what it really means is not living longer. That's not the point. That really means is postponing in time the onset of age-related diseases, so it can prevent or slow down the aging process to a certain extent, in certain cases revert it, which means delaying or revert chronic degenerative diseases of aging, like Alzheimer's, Parkinson, but the metabolic disorders like diabetes, fibrotic disorders like lung fibrosis, liver fibrosis, muscle waste like sarcopenia. So all those are driven by similar mechanisms. And that's really the main change, right? This is a medicine that doesn't target the mechanisms of each specific disease like we're doing now. Trying, for example, to suppress fibrosis in the lung has a very poor limited efficacy. This is a terrible disease, which is called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. It's a disease of aging. Typically associated with a later age, driven by those kind of mechanisms that we're talking about. And the current treatment is trying to suppress fibrosis, and really works poorly. It can give only, some time of life for patients that have very, only a few years from diagnosis, which is a terrible disease. Sometimes the drugs are also toxic, so they actually not help in improving the quality of life. But what if instead we can target what are the upstream, those master regulators that are not causing the fibrosis at the end, but are causing the progression of events that leads to this fibrosis over time, which is these biological aging mechanisms. If you can target them, you can stop or slow down significantly the progression of those diseases. This is true for any diseases that are driven by those mechanisms, which are in common. So these are called geroprotectors, because you don't just treat a disease, you treat the underlying mechanisms of multiple diseases that result from this. So by showing that one medicine works in one disease, you open opportunities to treat many, many others. And the next step is not to treat after someone is sick, but start to use this medicine before to prevent to become sick. And so extend health span. And that's where the longevity concept comes from.
Wonderful. So, listening to all this information, it may sound very complex, but in a way, I think this is a new innovative way looking at the biology, looking at, we are living in the 21st century. There are loads of substances that could reverse the process of, our cells becoming immunosenescent cells, so becoming old cells in our bodies and enhancing their regenerative effects. And I think moving into sort of a multiple sclerosis field, it's emerging field of discussion point in MS is about the impact of aging, the neurodegenerative process that is driven by neuroinflammatory process, the mitochondria dysfunction, and how does that impact on the smoldering lesions, which means that the non-active chronic lesions become active lesions in the presence of the of the mitochondria dysfunction and microglia activation, which is inappropriate activation and inflammatory processes are switched on in people who no longer having new accumulative white matter lesions within the brain parenchyma, but they have enlarging lesion, they have brain atrophy as part of this. And the way as neurologists with a special interest in multiple sclerosis, I'm looking for some sort of what's happening around in this world in this field of anti-aging, regenerative, rejuvenating the body cells. And I think that hence the Marco is here to discuss that. And I think although MS is neuroinflammatory condition, but to a certain extent, it's neurodegenerative process. And I think if we discover the agent that works on multiple other diseases, the MS comes into that sort of a group of conditions that could potentially have benefit. And of course, lifestyle plays a key and huge role in reversing the process, slowing down, nourishing the body cells and making them function at the very organelle mitochondria level, and with this sort of energy supply to the cell, which is mitochondria function. So I think these kind of advancements in the medicine attracts a lot of attention, and we have to start talking and perhaps talking to the experts like Marco. So what are the recent advancements in promising trial results involving supplements, maybe vitamin supplements that's accessible to the public, that they could purchase over the counter and buy some supplements to potentially delay the aging process and help with a regenerative process? How do these all work?
Well, first of all, you touch on a very important point, which is chronic inflammation. Right? This is really one of the underlying, necessity requirements for many chronic diseases. Not neurodegenerative, but in general, really, to escalate and progress into chronic degenerative process. Going back to what you're saying, this is one of the topics and focus of one of my companies is Rubedo Life Sciences, is focusing on those senescent cells. And what are those? Maybe let me introduce a little bit this concept that leads to your second questions as well. So cellular senescence is a mechanism that is induced in any cell of our body as a result of stress and damage, especially over time. And what happens is, healthy cells stop doing what it's doing because has been alarmed, right? There is maybe a virus or a mutation or a damage to the mitochondria, to your point, so the cell stops. And in a way, is a protective mechanism for us. Unfortunately, it's not just stopping and sitting there, but it starts to release a large amount of factors, like pro-inflammatory factors, like cytokines, metalloproteases, are pro-inflammatory factors, pro-fibrotic, pro-oncogenic factors that has a function. So it's like, come, find me, get rid of me signal. So it's telling the immune cells to migrate, to recruit them in the site where there was an insult, an injury, a damage, to get rid of them. And helping and promoting the immune cells and the stem cells to repair and regenerate. So this is what happens physiologically, normally, especially when we're young. Now, the problem is that with persistent damage, continuous stress and damage, which can happen, as we mentioned earlier, very quickly, like you can accelerate this, going back again, someone who is smoking cigarette is constantly intoxicating cells that undergo this response, which is the same trigger by, for example, the viruses, like I mentioned earlier, like in COVID and others. So if this happens, those cells start to build up in our tissues. The immune cells cannot get rid of them. This and switch function, so they become pathogenic. So they're technically called pleiotropic. So they can play both a positive or a negative function. Now, they're called senescent also because they're associated with aging in the sense that over time, over decades, naturally, we still, inevitably build up those cells in different tissues with different rates. But with those factors secreted, they drive this inflammation that cannot be cleared by the immune cells. They actually drive even more immune senescence to the immune cells. So they start to create this negative loop. They help each other to drive this chronic inflammation. In the field is even called inflammaging. It's a process that as you age, you get more inflamed. And at some point, the inflammation gets so bad that the different tissues have now different response to that degenerative response and results in many diseases. So that's a problem. But there is a solution to that. There are drugs designed to selectively remove those senescent cells. And they're called Senolytics. And that's what we do at Rubedo. So, and that's not that simple to make because senescent cells are not all the same. You have to think like cancer cells. Some are very different, depending on the tissue, depending on the disease. So it's not that you can just simply find and remove them. And so to solve this, at Rubedo, we build a platform that is leveraging single-cell multiomics, so genomic technologies at single-cell level, where we can take tissues from patients, analyze them using artificial intelligence, understand what they are, what are their vulnerabilities, how to target them, and then using novel chemistry to make molecules that are engineered to target specifically those senescent cells in the different positions, in different tissues and roles. So to treat specific conditions and then to prevent that different organs can reach that tipping point where the inflammation becomes so chronic and severe that drives diseases. So to prevent those diseases and extend health span. So that's what we're doing, developing Senolytics, very potent selective drugs that can have multiple use, therapeutic use, to again stop or reverse diseases of aging. And we are working on lung diseases, skin diseases, liver diseases, but we also did work in brain and muscle. To your point, we saw that we did it in animals, like in geriatric mice, very old mice, that they have dysfunction like dementia and neurodegenerative conditions. Where we see there is a high level of neuroinflammation, large amount of microglia activated in the hippocampus where the memory, for example, is developed. And then we treated those mice with one of our compounds. And we saw that the level of inflammation, neuroinflammation dropped. The number of microglia in the hippocampus dropped. The number of neurostem cells reactivated and increased without changing the neurons. So restoring sort of a healthy environment. And functionally, those mice started to learn again. So we tested their capacity to learn memory over time and orient themselves. And they performed as good as young mice. So very promising, although our first therapeutic areas are not in neurodegenerative, but moving to the clinic. That's certainly a very, very important aspect. Beyond therapeutics, there are other functions, like by treating chronic disease of aging of the skin, like chronic inflammatory skin conditions, like chronic dermatitis, especially the one aggravated in the elderly. But again, you can be 20 years old and have an aged skin and experience the same phenomenon. But it can also as an aesthetic function, like you rejuvenate tissue means that it will start to restore function and regain, cosmetic, also aesthetic function. So that there is not only therapeutic use, but restoring health means also restoring the original state of tissues, regrow hair, for example. So there are not this therapeutic use, there is a potential, let's say, cosmetic or aesthetic use. And then there is a preventive use, which is the ultimate goal. So then taking those drugs before, using biomarkers, which, this is a field that is growing. But one day you can go to the doctor, you do a blood test, and they say, okay, well, your cholesterol is good, but your level of senescence may be in your liver. It's a little bit elevated. So take this drug from Rubedo that it will clear your senescent cells in the liver. So in 20 years, you're not going to have a problem, right? Or in 10 years or etc. So that's a vision. That's where we're going. And we're actually starting a first clinical trial this year. So it's not that far from reality. We have drugs going to the clinic very quickly. What can we do today? Yes, there are many supplements, right, that you can take. Now, I have a rule for myself, which is never give advice, especially clinical advice, especially for anything that hasn't been proved and tested in a clinical trial. So there are lots of things that you could do with supplements right now, many supplements that are suggested to have potential effects, but I would be very careful, right? Some can be beneficial, some might be, probably the majority, not do much. Some can even be the opposite. And going back to the previous point, because we all age in different ways, we not necessarily all need the same intervention or at the same time. And so certain supplements might actually act on certain pathways that we may not need, or not right now, or not in that way. So that's a little bit my concern, right? We really need to understand very carefully how to build this new medicine. And I'm working, not just with the company, with other organizations. So the focus is build this ecosystem to create all the tools that we need, diagnostic, prediction, etc. So as we stratify patients and understand when and how to combine different interventions, so we will really take the benefit of it. That's why we should start with the specific diseases, test the effect on those where there are clear endpoints, and measure the impact on disease and learn what's the next step. So how can we apply those for other indication and eventually for healthy people? So supplements, some are benign, some that maybe I would feel more suggesting that, for example, there are supplements suggested to have a maybe mild effect, but in reducing the level of cellular senescence. So you think, well, that's good. I should take it. I should reduce it. But now, first of all, some of those are not natural products that are, if they work on experimental models published, and that's what we know. We also know that those are molecules that are poorly bioavailable. So you generally eat them and very little goes into your system. They are very, not potent at all. So you need a lot of it to work, which already means that what you take probably is not going to do anything by the time it's going to your system and can reach the cell that should work. And also have a very complex mechanism, so they have multiple methods of action. So maybe some of the benefit comes from other things, like simply being antioxidants. And on top of that, some people might benefit, some people might not. So that's where I think, while this is very exciting, and it's definitely a field that is growing, there are interventions we can do right now, but I always suggest it needs to be done under the supervision of a physician, where you can measure people that have the right understanding. You can measure biometrics, biomarkers, and understand what to use, and also monitor if those interventions, even if they're supplements, but supplements sometimes are simply molecules that haven't been tested and approved as drugs, but they could be. So you want be monitored to make sure that your changes are going in the right direction, for example, so a physician can tell you how to change your treatment regime, stop it, or continuing it.
Very, very interesting and eyes-opening in a way, because I think there is a huge market that people spend a huge amount of money on the supplements, and we could list them: enzyme, Q10, coenzyme Q10, NADS, which is NMN. Some people have quercetin, which is one of the Senolytics, isn't it? Is classed under Senolytics, and peptides, and some other hormones that are being used. I think there's a lot of going on. I'm not sure how many of these products coming from the black market, and how many, some sort of ideas are being shared, but there is no evidence-based to help yourself to slow down the aging process. So I think there are some studies in multiple sclerosis with metformin, with statins, which holds a bit of anti-inflammatory properties, although they are dedicated to medicine. One, metformin is for diabetes, statins are for cholesterol, lowering the cholesterol. So I think it's early days for us to tell in concrete terms whether these agents that would potentially reverse your or slow down the aging process. And I always say to my patients who take some vitamin supplements, if it includes the antioxidants, flavonoids, that can potentially theoretically nourish the body and enhance the function of mitochondria, let's say. Depends what supplement patients are taking. I guess very much depends what brands people buy, where they get the medicine, how safe they are. So, are they buying from internet, Amazon, or are they buying in the health shop or pharmacies? So these kind of things do matter. And I think, as Marco is saying, that without having the biomarkers, something that we could extract from your body, measure the level and what's most needed substance or peptide that you require to replace or add on, it's difficult to make the decision. Just broadly speaking, I think we are all heading towards the personalized care plans that we want to dedicate and write the management plan that is purely for you, for your individual body. So one size does not fit all. And in particular, this podcast is not medical advice. It's just an information that we're trying to share and advice. And I would like to also highlight a couple issues. Living with multiple sclerosis, there is a premature aging process. We see a lot of neurodegenerative process at a very early stage. When people first present with a clinical attack, they may not have diagnosis yet, but they had some features on the MRI scan and presenting with the first clinical attack. So it's almost 50% we see a degenerative process already. And that's really concerning because how we manage multiple sclerosis is anti-inflammatory properties and biologics that we use, disease-modifying therapies to modify the disease trajectory, but we're quite often failing to modify people's diseases from the degeneration, from slowing down the progressive nature of this condition. So this condition affects white matter and gray matter, and the gray matter is our higher cognitive function, is a surface, is a cortex, is our executive function, is reflecting that part of the brain, and we haven't got as yet medicine that could potentially control that process of degeneration and regeneration. Current trials are undergoing. So I guess there are some challenges that we face advancing the anti-aging research. And what are these sort of challenges when you run the research in longevity medicine? Anything to share, Marco, with us?
Well, challenges are always a lot, and not just in developing medicine, new drugs, drug discovery, and in this case is even more if you want, because it's a new emerging therapeutic opportunity and field. So there are a lot of things that needs to be developed. Like to your point, we're still in a way in a black box, and to measure really an impact on longevity or long-term aging trajectory requires time. At this moment, the only actual way to do this is to treat a patient and follow the patient for 10, 20 years. Now, that's impractical, right? Because that means a very expensive clinical trial. That means lots of variability. So we would need a lot of people to have statistical number that is meaningful, or in the thousands. And that needs lots of error, variability. In a trial, there are lots of things that can go wrong. Drop out. People don't do what you ask. Sometimes in a rigorous way that prevent this background noise of the data, right? This variability, especially if you think about doing this within the elderly or people that are sick for many years. Anyway, the bottom line is it's not possible right now really to answer to this question. But what we can do now is to measure the effect on diseases, right? Can we test this hypothesis of targeting underlying mechanism of inflammation that can have an impact on multiple sclerosis? Yes, because then you can measure benefits in a relatively short time. Is this the same that could have beneficial impact in the long term for maybe or someone that can develop the disease, but before? Possibly, but how do we measure that? So the field, us included, are developing biomarkers, things that can. One example is the so-called aging clock or epigenetic clock, which I'll talk about in a second. These are at the moment surrogates, but things that should tell us what's our biological age. So if you do an intervention that is changing it, reversing it, hopefully will translate is also change in functions, so change in health. And so a challenge is build those tools that you can actually measure something that is telling you pretty much is a prediction in the future. That if I change something now, means that in 10, 20, 30 years, there is an effect. And that's where the field is going. So there are two tracks. One is testing those in a way that is measurable in the short term, so measuring effects on diseases. And the other is building tools that needs to be validated, that give us the opportunity to measure something now that is reflecting potential changes in the future. So we know if a truly rejuvenative intervention works. Now, comments on what you were saying on the supplements. Yes, again, going to the point, it's very important also if you even take some that as a potential benefit, etc. But the brand is very important, or the source is very important. We and our colleagues tested several, and we found that sometimes what is indicated in the label is not accurate. They say maybe there is X amount, and sometimes the numbers can be 10 times less of what they say. So you're taking something that is doing nothing to you, or there are other things that can be toxin. Something maybe not in immediate terms, but there are elements that may not be good for you over time. And so another advice is, if you take supplements, is change brands through cycles, so you can flush out anything that might not be in the long term beneficial to you. And of course, getting clinical grade, best quality supplements is always the way to go, rather than order some on Amazon from an unknown source just because it's cheaper. Now, going back to challenges and opportunities, I would say, yes, there are, we have to show safety and efficacy. This is the first point, and then how that translates in long term for longevity. Now, I mentioned one intervention, which is Senolytics, so removing senescent cells. In a way, that means removing the bad cells, the bad players of aging.
Zombie cells.
The zombie cells, that's where, yes, so hunting zombies, because, and relatively there is an article on Nature a few years ago that calls about killing zombie cells. It's not a technical name in the field, but it's used in the field because, it's having cells, these living cells that don't die, and they are toxic, and they kind of, if they bite a neighboring cells, they can become zombies as well. So it's very similar. But then the other question also is, what is causing cells to become zombies? And can we prevent this? So can we have less zombie cells? So when a cell is a zombie, you have to get rid of it. And that's where one approach that we're doing at Rubedo, making drugs that get rid of the bad cells. Like you need to get rid of cancer cells, you need to get rid of senescent cells, at least several of those, several types, because they're pathologic. But can we also prevent this? Or in reverse, turn back the clock of cells so they don't become zombie? And the answer is yes. And how do we do that? Well, that's what we're doing in the other company, which is Turn Bio. And that's what we discover. And with a colleague of mine, another Italian professor, Vittorio Sebastiano at Stanford, we found a phenomenon that, an observation that was in the field is that, when we make babies, the cells of an embryo and of a newborn are age 0. You think, obviously. Well, it's not that obvious. If you think that there are two older parents and there's two older cells, the germline, so the egg and the oocyte and the sperm, they're coming from an older person. They have a memory of age, depends on the age of the individual, but yet they can make a new life that has an age 0. Now, if you think the first cloning experiment was the famous Dolly, right? We probably all remember that. That was a technology called nuclear transfer. The way it worked is that we took a nucleus from a somatic cell, so a cell that is not germline, so it's not an egg and a sperm, in that case it was a skin cell, and transfer the nucleus into a very early phase of the embryonic development and initiate then the embryogenesis. And Dolly was born. So you clone that organism, the sheep. However, what people know less is that Dolly was born old and aged prematurely, because with the nuclear transfer, you transfer also aging characteristics that are like written in the skin cell in that case. But that doesn't happen in nature when we make babies. So then we observe another thing, which is during a technology called induced pluripotent stem cells, or APS, which awarded a Nobel Prize to Yamanaka. Yamanaka discovered that against the dogma of that time, until 15 years ago, we thought that once the cells differentiate from an embryo into something, like into a neuron, into a skin cell, into a muscle cell, cannot come back. Only the germline can, right? And so that they can do an embryo. But Yamanaka discovered factors that can reprogram any cells and reverse that back into an embryo, embryonic cells, and then you can redifferentiate into something else. So all the ethical problem about cloning and everything kind of disappear, because now you can take a skin cell from yourself, reprogram it in vitro, and then redifferentiate into, let's say, your liver, and then you can repair and replace your liver. So that's kind of the promise in regenerative medicine. Very exciting. It's a real advance in the field in many ways. What we observe that even in this embryonic induced pluripotent stem cells, using these Yamanaka factors, when you reprogram an old cells and you move that back to an embryo and then redifferentiate back into something else, let's say from a skin back to an embryo and then again into a neuron, for example, the neuron that you obtain is young biologically. You lose this characteristic that are written of biological age from your starting donor cells from the skin, from let's say 80%, 80 years old person. And so we thought, so there is a machinery in our cells that is locked there, only used by the germline, that can be reopened and to rejuvenate not just the germ cells when we make an embryo, when we make a new life, but any cell of our body. Is it possible? Yes. So we found a way to do it, and we're developing a RNA-based therapy like the vaccine. So something you can deliver, but instead of delivering something that can induce your immune response for vaccination, we are delivering the special factors that can reprogram transiently any cells of your body, not just the germline, without changing identity, so without this de-differentiation. So your brain cell, your muscle cell, your skin cells will remain what it is. It just will become the younger version of itself. So healthier, and that's how you can prevent to become bad and can reactivate regenerative functions and restore, in a way, rejuvenate tissue. And we've done this, many others in animals, has been done even in primates, and clinical trials are starting soon. And that's another way to rejuvenate tissues. And my vision is those therapies can work synergistically. In the future, you could take a senolytic and a reprogramming factor and, really extend your health span.
Wow. Listening to all that, I started to believe that it's like a futuristic medicine, but it just indicates that if there are some ethical approaches, we could potentially, given the advancement in medicine, we could live forever. We are a bit far away from it, to be honest, because we haven't validated various different medicine, drugs, tools, biomarkers, etc. But imagine if we lived life where there were no rules, you could do whatever you want to, and based on the techniques that you discovered and established and identified, theoretically, just listening to that indicates that life is possible, and life is possible at the very young age biologically. I think what we'd like to say that I'm not sure whether our generation or future generation will see that, but I think in another hundreds of years, people will live really long lives and healthy lives. So I think what we need to emphasize here that we want a healthy aging process, and the agents that would help to achieve that that involves perhaps vaccination, Senolytics, lifestyle approach, exercises, sleeping, dieting, and if you combine all these factors together, I think it's possible to really achieve endless life. That's my understanding. That's my sort of interpretation, listening to the cloning, to the very innovative approach of changing, reprogramming the cells. I think that there's a whole CRISPR methods that are being used to change the DNA and reintroduce into the body to work on the cells that they wouldn't age that rapidly. I think it's mind blowing. Really is. And actually, I've seen the Dolly sheep at the very close distance that was in Scotland, Edinburgh, at one of the national museums. That was one of the museums. They sort of exponated the Dolly sheep, and beautiful sheep. I have no concerns whatsoever. It looks very real. So what I would like to go back and talk a little bit about the biological clock that you mentioned, that we're going to come back. So would you expand a little bit on that, our biological age?
Yes, and if I may, I will make a comment on the living forever thing. So again, when I was 5, I thought it was possible. And I think now, when I said I'm less naive, I think it's, theoretically possible, but we are way far from anything. I mean, what we're developing now is not about that. And as a simple fact, there is not a single scientific evidence that nobody was able to make any organism to live forever. So none of these interventions actually did that. And we don't have evidence that that's possible. From a physical standpoint, potentially, some people say, well, death is inevitable. Well, life is a unique concept of physics because it's an open thermodynamic system. It's not a closed thermodynamic system. So as long as so it pretty much is fleshing out the disorder. So it's not that you build entropy and then inevitably all these errors at the cellular level and DNA leads to aging. Yes, the error-driven hypothesis of aging is definitely, part of it, but that potentially can be changed. But we're not there yet. And there is no proof that it is possible with anything that we've done so far. What we know, though, we can definitely extend to a certain part in our life to maybe 10, 20%, maybe. But certainly we can extend the quality, the health span. So instead of spending 10, 20, 30 years of life, now you hit generally the 60, 65 average. Some people sooner, some people later. But that's chronologically that's why your chronological age, you start to have this sudden decline and exponential risk to develop many diseases of aging. And before that, you were healthy, your tissues work fine, and you start to feel pain, and then you start to have little things, and you start to develop multiple comorbidities, and one or the other disease start to kick in first and others follow. So that can be changed. So what if you can live a life where you hit 100 and you still feel like a 50 years old, you can still run a marathon? That's possible. But you probably are going to die very quickly. Instead of a slow decline, you might, in the ideal world, hit 100 and then one day you fall asleep and you don't wake up. Because that is different than life, and living longer, and it's different than aging. So the dying process is different than aging process, although they're connected. So without going into too many details, so when I want to say that people say, well, we're already too many in this planet. You want to add, have people living longer and only maybe the rich people can afford that. No, we're talking about medicine for everyone, really like an aspirin in the future that you take at the right time for the right long enough. So you help yourself to stay healthy, but you need to help yourself. No, you need to also you need to build an education that you need the right nutrition, exercise, like you said, and a number of lifestyle that can help us to stay that way. So we can help to extend this definitely quality of life over time. And so from a socio-economical standpoint, it's mandatory because it is becoming unsustainable, right? The cost, healthcare cost, social cost from an aging population that is sick and shrinking of a younger population by reducing the birth rate, etc., is a problem. Who's going to sustain the cost? But if this elderly population is healthy, actually becomes an additional major contributor, not just as a workforce. That's not the point, but we add a generation to the society, probably the wisest, not the older in that case, that can maybe change their role in society, not be burdened. And so it can, I think, only improve the planet and the society. It's not going to be a problem. So extending health span, not really lifespan. But how do we measure it? So this aging clock, you're asking, what is this aging clock? So there are different ways that can sort of give us an indication of biological aging. An example, and some of the most popular, for example, measure changes on the epigenome. So what is the epigenome? The epigenome is this structure where the DNA is wrapped around. And it's not just a scaffold. It's not just there to hold the DNA, and it's what makes a chromosome, for example, but as a functional role. So it's telling how to use to the cell, how to use the DNA. Because if you think, every cell in the body has the same genomic information. We have the same DNA everywhere in every cell, but we have many types of cells. They work differently. Why? Because they use the genetic material in a different way. I always like to use this metaphor of the epigenome like a director of an orchestra, while the DNA is the orchestra. And so all the different instruments. And you can take an orchestra and play so many different music. So that epigenome is the one decides how to play this music. And it can turn into the makeup of any different cell types. When we're young, or when a cell is young, the music is clean and fine-tuned, and everything works perfectly. But as we age, we start to have, the instruments get off tune, and you start to have noise. And this epigenetic noise is what causes cells to become dysfunctional, and eventually can become, for example, senescent, or die, or even become cancerogenic, along with mutations. That's another problem on the DNA, but this is on the epigenome. So if you measure, so there are markers, there are ways that, that this epigenome is labeled. And those labels can change over time and is telling us if it's accumulating errors and noise. And that correlates with the biological age that sometimes generally is matching the chronological age, but can be mismatched. You could say, hey, you're 40 years old and your your epigenetic clock. It's telling that you're 40 years old. Now, good. Now you can maybe do better. You can be 35 biologically. Or you can say, you know what? Your epigenetic clock says that you're 50. But again, in which tissue? Let's say in your skin. So careful. Your skin is aging. You need to do something about it. I think so. Those clocks are pretty accurate to say that. Now, what we don't know yet is, okay, you say you do an intervention, and now you measure again, and you see that your epigenetic clock is saying that your skin or brain is now younger. Does it mean that functionally is regaining function, is actually rejuvenated? That we don't know yet. So is this epigenetic clock more a readout, like scratch on the surface of a car, and we're just painting it, but the car is still rusting, or we actually remove the rust from it? And those are validations and needs to be done. But if we prove that those epigenetic clocks are accurate to predict, then we have a tool, for example, to measure your age now, knowing the trajectory that you're taking over decades. And that's where the field is going. And it's one example. There are other clocks of aging that can use many different features. Even just pictures of your face and using AI can predict your biological aging to a certain extent, for example, how your face is changing. So there are many, many ways to measure, and the field is coming together, building an accurate panel that one in non-distant future can use to do this kind of predictions.
Really enjoyed listening to the analogy about the orchestra and how our organs and cells place the song in that unity, and if one is off the range and not in tune, so that gives a lot of noise in the background, and that's what happens in our bodies, in our beautiful cells, that if they are off the order, they obviously drag the whole pro-inflammatory process, and the aging starts, and the degenerative process starts, and we really struggle. We really, suffer. And I think I heard some people saying that when the spine gets into sort of wear and tear, like with this bulging and degenerative process, this is your first sign of the aging process. I don't know how true is that, but I see a lot of neurologically impaired patients with various different pains and aches in the body, and usually by default, spine is affected. And there are so many other cells in the body that we really want to nourish and look after, because, even living with a chronic condition, if other comorbidities plays the key role, it really worsens your underlying chronic condition. And I know that from various different research and clinical trials that indicates that if you have a cardiovascular risk factors, diabetes, hypertension, maybe some metabolic problems, thyroid problems. So really that worsens the outcome. Living with multiple sclerosis, people become even more disabled with multiple symptoms, and then it's difficult to say which symptom is what. And I think thinking about if we are able to achieve at age 50 having biological age 30, of course you probably will have less package of the comorbidities beside, and you will be doing much, much better. So theoretically thinking, I think our future is really bright. Having these innovative treatments available, we will be able to tweak and change and have a very amazing lives. But as Marco is saying, that extending the average lifespan could have a very profound societal impact, including changes in the population dynamics, extending working ages. Who wants to work until 70? And the pressures on the pension schemes and social care systems. Ethical longevity research must consider these potential outcomes and engage in dialogue with policymakers to plan and shape the future where people may live significantly longer, but maybe having good quality of life, that they live longer. That's our ultimate goal and aim. And I think to finalizing our discussion today, I could talk, Mark, with you forever, to be honest. This is my most favorite episode. The fascinating topic and planning and sort of a brainstorming of the future. And to your mind, looking towards the future, what developments do you foresee in anti-aging therapies? What is coming? What is going to be?
Yeah, we are in this really transition from science to preclinical development to clinical development. And there are already a few clinical trials started, and several are starting. We are starting. So it will take a few years to have the first drugs approved. But I really see it in the next, probably, within the 5 years, we will start to have the first FDA, European regulatory approved worldwide. It's medicines that are targeting this biological aging process, although they will not be geroprotectors quite yet, because will not be tested and validated as such, right? And as I said, we don't have the framework to do that, although we're working on it. There are proposals like the TAME trial using metformin wants to be one of the first framework to test this hypothesis, although metformin may not necessarily be the best geroprotector and may not work in the same way for everybody. I would say that many things we know of metformin is true of this, long-term effects, but mostly it's from diabetic person, and healthy person, even more an athlete, might actually not benefit. If you're exercising and you're healthy, non-diabetic, metformin might not be what you need. But the concept is building these tools where we can test those medicine really as geroprotectors. So in the next 5 years, we will have the first. We will have the first Senolytics. We have the first medicine that, for example, can prevent sarcopenia, and in other ways to target chronic inflammation, mitochondrial boosting, preventing mitochondrial decay, epigenetic reprogramming, so this cellular rejuvenation for very specific applications. But that's really the first step. And that will start this revolution, because we will start to see patients using it. And as follows, physicians will probably start to use them off-labels as well. And so that's how the field will really give us a real-life readout. But it will probably be within the next 10 years that we really start to see a wide use, especially other tools like those clock and many other things that are coming together, wearable, way to measure, way to track, is building this framework on how to apply longevity medicine. So I think this is a realistic trajectory. And of course, science and medicine, they move fast and slow at the same time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward, to be honest, to see how it's all going to evolve. For the listeners, sarcopenia is a muscle volume loss. As we age, we become skinnier. The muscles become atrophic, and that's a sort of underlying a condition that's usually seen in elderly people. And that's what Marco covered during this speech, that we want the bodies to look healthy, not just inside at the cell level to be them healthy and nourished and function well at the DNA level, but we also want to look good as well, and have appropriate number of the tissues, collagen, muscles, skin, the elasticities, everything needs to be part of this long life and good quality of life and having a good health as part of this journey. So for our listeners, to finalize, people who want to stay informed about the longevity medicine, what the resources or methods do you recommend? Where to find this information? Are there any sort of charities or any, I don't know, some hubs that people could tune in and have a bit of a deep understanding and follow up on this topic?
Well, yes. Also involved in a charity, non-profit. It's a scientific society called the Fidon Institute, and there are others. The reason I founded this, where I'm the president right now, this society, we founded this with a number of key opinion leaders from academy, from industry, really a 360-degree, is to bring awareness of what this longevity medicine is, but also clear from the noise. Unfortunately, there is lots of misconceptions around this longevity space. Is now is a buzz, which is in a way a good and a bad thing. There is lots of pseudoscience and snake oil associated with that. So we really want, as an organization, to raise the scientific bar and rigor and focus on the different areas of longevity and not like mix and match all together and avoid that people start to do things to themselves that might be biohacking in a harmful way, or that the field can do step backs because there are misleading information that can slow down the progress. So it's important. I always say, like used to say, festina lente in Latin means move quickly, slowly. Try to move fast, slowly. So we need to do this and be careful how we do it. So find the right sources. I can speak for the one that I'm actively involved, which is a Fidon Institute. That's one source, but there are several others that really are kind of distributing good information. Longevity.technology is a media channel, for example. Lifespan.io, Fight Aging. It's, these are different websites or organizations that are like promoting with good rigor and scientific focus progress in the field. And there are many others. Again, I'm not sponsoring or talking one that is best to the other, but I recommend to look who is behind, if there are really accredited people that are speaking, and always question and be careful. This is a very early days for a field and that is moving fast, but I would say don't rush and be patient.
Wonderful. That's really nice practical advice for our listeners. So, Dr. Quarta, thank you immensely for joining us today and sharing your profound insights into the future of longevity medicine. It's been an enlightening discussion that not only broadens our understanding of aging, but also inspires hope for future medical breakthroughs.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Strauchiana. It was such a pleasure to be a guest in your podcast and share a little bit something of my experience to your listener. I hope it was somewhat inspiring and it can help, and certainly giving hope that the medicine is changing and there is a very new promising medicine for diseases that are untreatable now that can be very soon. So thank you for having me here.
Amazing. Thank you. To our listeners, thank you for tuning into the Be Well with MS podcast. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts to ensure you never miss an episode. For more information, visit my website at www.BeeWellWithMS.com. Also, I encourage everyone to follow Dr. Quarta's groundbreaking work. You can find more about his research and projects through his professional profiles and also publications linked to, we will add all the links appropriate on the show notes on the podcast platform as well and website. So until next time, stay informed and inspired as we continue to explore exciting health topics that matter to you and your loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you.